Well, with that, we will jump right into our first session, the equality of moral errors with Kai Whiting and Leonidas Konstantakos. Those who don't know these two, they are very often working together as a pair. And I got to meet both of them together a few Stoicons back. They have, I guess you could say, a really, what would you call the relationship? I'll let you talk about that in a bit. It's they play off of each other in collegial ways. Kai is a Stoicism and sustainability researcher who is based at UC Leuven, Belgium. Along with Leonidas, he's the co-author of Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living in a recent book. And his favorite ancient Stoic is Phaedrus. He might tell you about that here. Leonidas is a researcher, and he works on just war theory from a Stoic perspective at Florida International University, co-author of the book. And he is a fellow veteran. He served in the U.S. Army during the Iraq War, committed to bringing ancient Stoic principles to light so that contemporary Stoics can navigate the challenges of environmental deterioration and biodiversity loss, something that Kai is also incredibly interested in. So with those introductions, I'm just going to quickly turn it over to both of them. It's great to see both of you again, if only virtually.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Nice to see you too. So yeah, I'll just say quickly that it's going to be a hopefully shorter presentation with a Q&A, and then I hopefully will be fending off your questions. So I will do the heavy lifting in the beginning, and then I'll throw it over to both of us, but predominantly Leonidas. Okay, so I'm just going to share. Oh, Phil, can I share the screen?
Go ahead.
Okay, let me try again. Here. And myself. Can everyone feel, is the screen being shown? Sorry.
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent. Well, that's brilliant. Okay, so today, as we've just said, I will be presenting with Leonidas Konstantakos on the equality of moral errors. And unfortunately, this Stoic concept gets very little ink. You won't hear much about it at all. And we think this is to the detriment of a better understanding of the Stoic concept of justice and cosmopolitanism, which I won't define because Aldo Nucci will discuss this in his talk later. So I think, yeah, who are we? We've just heard from Greg that we are university lecturers and researchers, and we are the co-authors of Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living in. And really the key thing here is we wanted to show how Stoic principles can make a difference in the world, not just for ourselves, but everybody. So for example, and in line with Leo's expertise, we showed how the ancient Spartan king Cleomenes III, with the support of his wife, Queen Andi, used Stoicism to enact socio-economic and land reforms for the betterment of the Spartan people. And increasingly in my case, for example, I've looked at how Stoicism can offer an alternative perspective on council culture and advance matters linked to free speech. So these kind of topics are also some things we're talking about in the walled garden community, an initiative I developed with Simon Drew that we'll be listening to for 3 minutes in the lightning round, and Sharon LaBelle, who is on a panel later today. So what do we like, Leo and I, about Stoic ethics? We like the fact that we are completely responsible for our own happiness. There's no amount of money or status that will help us become happier, and there's no level of sickness or poverty that will prevent us from being happy. There's no one who can stop us from building a good character, even if we have the direst of circumstances. But it's key here, building a good character isn't just about me and Leo. It's about becoming aware that we alone are responsible for our own happiness. We can free our mind to pursue what really matters when we realize that we are responsible for the happiness by just pursuing virtue and a life worth living. When we know that we can do that, we then become capable of contributing to a world worth living in, as we explain in our book, Being Better. And how do we make the world a better place? We just decide to do what is right. So I just want to thank Rocío Lotores for this picture, because this figure, because I think it's very helpful. And in her figure, we can clearly see that the only thing worthy of pursuing from a Stoic perspective is virtue. So what is virtue? It's a character it's cultivating a character that is incapable of being vicious. That's to say, we are not cowardly, we're not unjust, we're not greedy, and we're not ignorant in terms of our character. It is an internal process that does not rely on anything outside of the circle that the field has drawn. Therefore, for example, a good person will always use money appropriately, no matter how much or little they have. And I'd just like to point out something that Greg Sadler said in Stoicon-x Norway, because a lot of people think, okay, then nothing but virtue matters at all on any level. It's completely irrelevant to every decision we'll ever make. And Greg said this: everything except virtue is of secondary importance. It's not that nothing else matters. It's just that nothing else matters sufficiently as to have a bearing on your character for good or for bad. So it doesn't guarantee your happiness, but it's not that it's completely irrelevant to how we make decisions. So how do Stoics work on their character? They recognize that they are only in control of their decisions, their actions, their thoughts, their attitudes, and that everything else is not entirely up to them. They think carefully about how to react or respond to a situation that they are involved in or have become aware of. Remember, we don't need to have an opinion on everything. I know Twitter would suggest otherwise, but we really don't have to have an opinion on everything. In Stoicism, we're called to note our biases or our blind spots, to separate observation from emotion and calibrate accordingly. We need to be careful to distinguish what we feel from what we're thinking. And yes, there is a difference between feeling and thinking. To the best of their ability, Stoics make correct decisions, ones that are appropriate given the information they have, which is in line with their roles and responsibilities. So let me give you an example. Two people come across a dying person. One of them is a medical doctor, and they will be called to do everything they can to save the person that is dying. But so will a non-medical person, a lay person. They will also be called to do everything they can, but they might restrict themselves to calling an ambulance rather than providing medical attention. So I think the best way to explain the Stoic concept of the equality of moral errors is through an example. In this scenario, there are two speeding drivers, which we've conveniently called Leo and Kai. Both lose control going 70 miles an hour around a bend near a school. Kai loses control, runs onto the pavement, and unfortunately hits a kid. Leo does exactly the same thing, but he hits a tree. When we think of this scenario, what do we imagine when we think, which of them is the bad guy? Is Leo somehow better than Kai? Is Kai worse than Leo? Which mistake is worse? Is it worse to hit the tree from a moral perspective, or worse to hit something else? And therefore, as we're talking about Stoicism and character, what do these incidents say about Kai's character and Leo's character? What do we think when we ask ourselves those questions? Now, this is key for Stoics. Solely on the decision to speed. So imagining we know nothing else about Leo and Kai. We just know that they took the decision to speed unjustly. Leo and Kai are as bad as each other. Both of them made exactly the same mistake. And so both of them are equally blameworthy when it comes to their unjustified decisions to speed. It's not like Kai in this scenario decided to hit a kid as he overran the pavement any more than Leo decided to hit a tree. Now, I know many of us will be feeling very uncomfortable because we have modern sensitivities and a legal framework that is linked to the idea of consequentialism, which generally can be said to say consequences make an action morally good or morally bad. That doesn't mean just because we believe or we feel that consequentialism works, that we are automatically the progressive ones. What? So you're telling me, I can hear your thoughts, like you're telling me, so the Stoics say that running over a child and running into the tree is the same thing? Well, Stoic logic dictates that there are no degrees of vice or virtue. Something is either done virtuously or viciously. There's no in between. But before you throw in the Stoic towel and say, oh, I can't deal with this, I can't possibly be a Stoic if that means that they're exactly the same thing, know that you're in really good company. One of the most important ancient Stoics of all time, the Roman slave Epictetus, who actually went on to establish his own Stoic school, was just as surprised when his mentor, Musonius Rufus, said exactly the same thing. So according to Musonius, unjustly setting fire to the Capitol and unjustly kicking a stork's nest are examples of the same type of moral error. Now, there is a caveat here, because when it comes to how to respond to someone's moral error, a Stoic will try to ascertain whether that moral error was committed out of an aversion to pain or a weakness for pleasure. Did they react because they were suddenly hurt and thought, for example, that pain was bad? Or did they have a feeling that they wanted, say, more luxuries in their life, and did they commit moral errors as a result? Also, the Stoics do recognize that some moral errors come from a hardened and incurable character, and others do not. But all moral errors, all of them, are committed out of the inability to distinguish what is good, bad, or neither. For if we truly knew what we were doing was bad for us, we would cease doing it. Likewise, if we truly knew what was good for us, we would do it. So upon becoming a Stoic teacher, Epictetus noticed the same kind of problem, that his own students had misunderstood the equality of moral errors like he had done previously, which is quite useful for us to know, because this means that this concept is very important in Stoicism, because he took the time to tell the story of his own doubts, Musonius's response, and the doubts of his students. One of Epictetus' students, for example, made the case there was no way that the logic mistake that he had made in the classroom would ever have been or could ever be as bad as unjustly killing his father. Epictetus reminds him of a very key Stoic concept that many people call the dichotomy of control. So Epictetus says, but the only things you can control are your thoughts, your actions, and attitude in the present moment. So in the present moment, the only moment that actually exists and that matters, you made a mistake in logic. You failed in the only way you could. The fact that you can mention your father and a hypothetical murder doesn't have anything to do with the present moment at all. And therefore, from a Stoic perspective, it doesn't exist. Only the present exists. And if you think about it, even if the student went on to unjustly kill his father, he would do so because he falsely believed that that was the reasonable thing to do in the circumstances, which means from a Stoic perspective, he would have acted irrationally. And this point, if anybody wants to know, is this discourse is 1.732 to 33. So this is a discussion that he had in that particular part of Epictetus' discourses. So I just want to summarize quickly the concept. Every moral mistake we make is equally bad. There are no degrees. A decision is correct or it's incorrect. There's no in between. The consequences of our mistakes don't make them better or worse than they are already. It's not because something happens to turn out well for me that my decision proves to be the correct one. It just turned out well despite my mistake. Now, it's key here that we consider again, consequences occur in the future, and we do not control the future. We only control the decisions we make and the attitude we have in the present moment. Now, I enjoy this because people often say to me, because of Leo and I's work on things like climate breakdown and unjust economic inequality, that they'll say things like, my actions won't make any difference at all when it comes to standing against environmental or social injustice, because other people will do X or Y. Other people won't pay their employees properly. Other people will throw plastic in the sea. Even if I don't, it won't make a difference. But the Stoics are clear here. We don't control other people. We don't control the consequences of their actions. We don't even control the consequences of our actions. So none of that has a bearing on what constitutes an appropriate action from a Stoic perspective. Now, again, I want to have a caveat here because it's clear that I'm not saying, so that it is clear that I'm not saying that all consequences and punishments should be equal. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the error is the same, but the consequences of the punishment, for example, can be, and perhaps ought to be, different. The problem is here that too often in the modern world, we immediately associate an action or a conviction to a person's character. So that means that a person convicted of murder is called a murderer rather than a person who has committed a murder. And this means that they're often seen as a quote unquote bad person, no matter what they subsequently do or who they become. Now, this is a key point here, because although we can distinguish ourselves, or try to, between ourselves outside of the incarcerated system and, say, the people inside, what would be our life like? What would our own life like? What would our own life be like if we were forever defined by the worst moment, our moment of temporary madness, if we were angry, a moment where we really should have done something that we did? What would that say about us? So this brings me on to something that is very key, and this is Stoicism and moral luck. Sometimes we are just lucky. Sometimes things we prefer to happen do happen to us, and we think that's great. Yes, something good happened to us, and actually something preferable happened to us, because the only thing that's good is building a character, right? Sometimes things that we don't particularly like happen to us. So in the case with Kai and Leo, it is definitely preferable in most people's minds to hit a tree rather than run over a child. But does that give this character called Leo the ability to shrug his shoulders and laugh off the fact that he was lucky enough to hit a tree rather than someone else's child? And I think, as does Leo, that this brings us on to an important point of self-awareness. The beautiful thing that we find about the equality of moral errors is that we are reminded that we are subject to the same errors as everybody else. We're not better than anybody else or worse than anybody else in the way that we can have, accidentally commit an error. And although we would sometimes like to hide away people in prison for having done something that we find terrible, or we might cancel them because they are different politically or they have a different religious allegiance, and they're really not that different to us. And we might secretly hope they are, but in Stoicism, we again can say, I'm human, they're human, I'm capable of mistake, and so is the other person. So if we return to the speeding example, we have the fortunate Leo who hit the tree and the unfortunate Kai who didn't. But how many of us can honestly say, if we have ever driven, that is, we have never ever sped, ever? I imagine that if you do drive, you can think of at least once where you might have got away with speeding. How many times have we got away with things like speeding just because of sheer luck? That the police officer wasn't around the corner, that perhaps our car was faster than the police officer could reach us. How many times have we done something that we knew was wrong, that we found stupid even in the moment, or even completely unnecessary? This then allows me to ask the question, is Leo so much better than Kai because we don't typically imprison people for hitting trees? And I just want to point up here on the right, the quote here, that in order to know that we're doing wrong and to reform ourselves, we must wish to set it right. If we just simply recognize that we're doing wrong, or we think we recognize, we aren't actually recognizing until we do something about the error, because we're not actually knowing from a Stoic perspective. It is not enough to go, yes, I should have done something, if we do not then walk in that and change and sculpt our character in a way that we would no longer commit those kind of errors. So I think the key thing here is something about reconciliation. And I think, as does Leo, that Stoicism offers a powerful tool for reconciliation, because it helps us to recognize the worst parts of ourselves, the worst day in Kai's life, for example, and the best day in other people's. It encourages us to recognize the times when we have wronged others, and it does not allow us the luxury of merely focusing on when and how others have wronged us. So in short, Stoicism reminds us that we are called to engage in constructive dialogue, finding common ground despite our differences. And that remains true when we are hurting. We cannot hide behind being hurt. We have to step forward. We have to cultivate and sculpt that character, because that's the only true worthy thing of pursuing. Stoics believe that everything that happens is ultimately for our benefit. Even the worst day of your life will ultimately benefit you if you allow it to. So therefore, we can learn from our mistakes. And importantly, we should give people space to learn from theirs. This means that we can grow and flourish regardless of our past. And so importantly, can others. So I just want to reflect on the fact that the Stoics did recognize something about moral luck that is worth mentioning here. They reflected on the moral luck of having been exposed to Stoic philosophy, which is a special type of moral luck. They recognized that if we are sitting here today, right now, we're lucky enough to have access to the Stoic teachings, or things that people are going to say about the Stoic teachings. We are lucky enough to have a community across the world, across time zones. We've just seen how many people are in our chat telling us exactly where they're from and how they have the same interests and how they want to be better people and create a better world. We're lucky enough to have a community of like-minded people who are interested in learning and developing on contemporary aspects of Stoicism. We're lucky enough to have a mind that is capable of reason and a character that can be shaped into a good one, as long as we take the conscious decision to consistently act appropriately. And this is key because it should lead us to be compassionate towards others. Stoicism is not about being unfeeling. It's not about being cold. It's about a cosmopolitan vision. And again, Aldo Nucci will talk about that later, so I don't want to talk about it more, but it's about knowing that we're part of the community, that we belong to the cosmopolis. It's not about being individuals who are separated from other people and being distant from them. And this allows us to be thankful that we are lucky enough to have engaged in Stoic ideas and capable of recognizing that not everyone has had the opportunity that we have today, or necessarily the skill set to make the most of Stoic ideas. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions or reading them. And yes, they'll hand over to predominantly Leo. This is the only thing I want to say. If you're particularly interested in the academic papers that we've been working on, then please contact me at stoichigh.com and I'll send it to you. And just so you know, Being Better Stoicism for a World Worth Living In is currently available in English as a physical book, ebook, or audiobook. Thank you.
So now we have some time for questions and answers, about 8 minutes or so. There are two that showed up in the chat that I'll put to you right away, and I think some other people will be asking some as well. So Candace Thompson, about 6 minutes ago, asked if we have control over our choices and our choices and actions are causally connected to the consequence. Don't we minimally have secondary influence on the consequence? And I think that could use a little explanation. It set off a whole comment stream that maybe you've seen or maybe you haven't, but can you respond to that one? Do we have a kind of secondary influence on things?
Right. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, here, let me say right off the bat, like, it's up to us to decide how much is going to persuade us, right? We're the ones at the end of the day to decide whether or not we're going to be Stoics or whether we're not going to follow teachings. But if we're going by what the Stoics are saying, then it's quite clear that, killing someone unjustly, murder, is every bit as bad as kicking a stork's nest. All right. So because it's you made the one wrong decision you could make here, right? I mean, for the most part, like, murder is going to have tremendous consequences, but the consequences really aren't up to us if you're a Stoic, right? I mean, how many people are just too sick to be able to get out of bed to murder who they want to murder, right? So the Stoics saying, when it comes to, we get these impressions, and then we decide whether or not we want to assent to these impressions or not, or withhold assent to these impressions. Now, the impression that you get, you bring these up against your preconceptions, and you decide, okay, I'm going to accept this impression as true, or I'm not. Now, what's in front of you at the moment, in the Stoics' very immediatist moral epistemology, is what is up to you at the moment is deciding whether or not this is right or wrong. Now, sometimes that may be whether or not you're going to kick a stork's nest unjustly, or whether or not you're so angry at the person in front of you that you're going to murder them. Now, the consequences aren't really up to you, and the law as we know it takes into account the consequences, whether or not whether or not the bullet wasn't a dud, whether or not it was, whether or not your aim was that, attempted murder is different charge than murder. And maybe rightly so. We can talk about law of reformation some other time. But if we're talking about the moral blame or the moral praiseworthiness, then the Stoics say it's the same. You made the one mistake you could make here, whether it be a mistake in logic or whether it be burning down the Capitol. You had an impression that doing this was correct, even though it isn't, which you should have understood what is right, wrong, and indifferent, and then you acted accordingly. Or we should say, inappropriately by making that moral error. The consequences aren't up to you, but your decisions are. Right?
So in relation to reconciliation in a Stoic perspective, how does a Stoic reach a point of reconciliation dealing with an individual reasonable and purely driven on a...
Okay, so I'm going to try to answer this one. It cut off a little bit at the end, but if I'm not answering your question, please stop me and let me know. So there's a few different suggestions for this. Marcus Aurelius is huge on this. Like throughout his own works, he's reminding himself that, look, at the end of the day, this person doesn't even know what's good for them. They don't even know what's wrong for them. And that allows himself, the most powerful man in the world at this point, to say, even my worst enemy isn't that bad. They're confused, they're wrong. And how many times have I been angry, he might say. I mean, there's a passage, like a very stark, grim passage in Marcus, where he's like just talking about some jerk that's in his way. And he's like, this person's an animal, and he really doesn't name this person, but he's expressing this kind of low-key anger, right? It's low-key resentment. And so he has to remind himself often enough, like, even my worst enemy isn't that bad. I'm also capable of making the mistakes. Sometimes people make these mistakes and the consequences are very dispreferred. We might say terrible, but sometimes the consequences are preferred. But that's not up to us. What's up to us is how we look at these impressions in front of us and decide that they're good, bad, or indifferent. Right? That's really what's up to us. So how do we reconcile? So for Marcus, it's reminding himself that this person is just one more person that isn't lucky enough to have access to to all the Stoics before him, right? I mean, Marcus, all he wanted to do was be a philosopher. He got sucked into a 20-year war, but he wanted to be a philosopher, right? Not everybody has that kind of will or that kind of opportunity, right? We're very lucky to do that. And there are other ways, right? For example, someone like Seneca, his job is something different, right? His job is like to try to improve, and he writes a whole book in the Mirror of Princes mode to try to make Nero better, right? And fail spectacularly, as we can see. But that's his way, a type of education. It wasn't Marcus's job to educate; it was Seneca's job to educate. So to some extent here, I think it depends on your social role, how you're going to reconcile. You might have social influence and be a reformer, or you might be able to be to say to yourself, my brother. I've been angry about for the last 20 years. You know what? I might be angry at him, and maybe we can't have this kind of relationship. But my nephews and my nieces aren't involved with this at all. The problem with me and my brother doesn't carry on to my nephews and nieces. And I think it must depend on your social role, and the way you reconcile kind of depends on also your own individual nature and what you're good at, whether it be fighting, unfortunately fighting wars, as in Marcus's case, unfortunate for him. Or it might be in Seneca's way, education. I think that's something everybody has to kind of answer for themselves. Right?
So that's good. And I've got one to piggyback on that. And we have only about a minute to answer it. So I'm going to read it quickly. How do we understand virtue within large systems that disenfranchise people and limit them? I think this kind of ties in with the moral luck matter, right?
I hate to say this, Greg, but you're cutting off again.
I can try and answer it quickly.
Okay.
It's not that Stoics don't recognize that there are systems that give people some material goods that others don't. Material goods is in things that others don't get. You're just saying the only thing that truly matters is character. So if a Stoic says it does, but I quoted you, it's not that we should ignore the fact that there's economic inequality. Of course not. We have to ask, is that just? If it's not, we have to do something about it because it says something about our character. So we're not ignoring people's plight of poverty. What we're saying is that poverty doesn't make a difference. They can still be good people.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Kai's saying. That's absolutely right. I mean, there are things we can do in order to do this. I mean, there are things we have to take into consideration when we attempt to reconcile and understand that our virtue depends on how we treat other people, how we bring people into our concentric circles, right? It's not like, oh, I'm so virtuous, I don't care about anybody else. No, your virtue depends on your caring, right?
Okay, well, that is a good set of responses, and we are now at the top of the time. So thanks very much to Kai and to Leo for this excellent kickoff presentation.